Like a national guitar, the Mississippi Delta is gleaming. Two lads met at a Queen's School talent show in 1953. They were the most popular musical duo by 1970. Then someone made an inexcusable statement. It's not about money or music. They refused to talk backstage and sang flawless harmonies on stage for the next 10 years. Behind the other's back, one recorded 30 solo tunes. Without asking, the other person deleted the vocals. One referred to the other as a monster in print in 2015. It would be 9 years before they spoke again. Childhood pals turned into enmity in this way. On October 13, 1941, Paul Simon was born in Newark, New Jersey. His parents were Jews from Hungary. Belle, his mother, was an elementary school teacher. Louis, his father, had a double life. He was a college lecturer by day. At night he performed as Lee Sims, a bassist in dance bands. Both music and books filled their home. Paul was surrounded by rhythm, structure, and tradition as a child. He went to synagogue with Belle. He went to Yankee Stadium with Louis. It was more than baseball to see Mickey Mantle and Joe Diageo. The topic was heroes. Paul would write Diageo into Mrs. Robinson years later. According to Donald Fagen, Paul was the quintessential New York Jewish child who enjoyed baseball and music, two activities that frequently gave immigrants a sense of belonging. The family relocated to the Kew Gardens Hills neighborhood of Queens in 1945, when Paul was only 4 years old. Everything changed with that transfer. It was more than a new house. The world was different. Watching Louis perform on television series like The Jackie Gleason Show and Arthur Godfrey and his pals kept the family up late. Paul witnessed his father's quick transition from educator to entertainer. It made a mark. He understood that music was more than just sound. It was profession, performance, and identity. There were many Jewish families in the Queens neighborhood that valued education and music. Every sound was absorbed by Paul. He learned about Woody Guthrie, jazz, and Lead Belly's gritty folk blues. His perspective on the world was influenced by all of it. Soon after, he discovered a musical hero at his school. Paul was 11 years old in 1953. He witnessed a youngster his age, Art Garfunkel, sing by himself on stage during a talent show at Public School 164. A girl said in a whisper that he was good. It was that. Paul became enamored not only with singing but also with the notion of using singing to win over others, particularly women. Later that year, when they both performed in Alice in Wonderland for their 6th grade graduation, the two reconnected. They saw it as the beginning of a musical empire, even though it was only a school performance. It seemed as if their voices were born to be together. They played at block parties and school dances as the Pepton, a doo-wop trio. Paul began penning tunes. He has already penned their first original work by the age of 13. They had evolved from peers by the age of 15. They were musicians who recorded music. Inspired by their love with the Everly Brothers, they recorded the song Hey Schoolgirl in 1957 under the names Tom and Jerry. They accidentally wrote it while attempting to recall Hey Doll Baby's lyrics. To record a demo, they managed to cobble together $25. For children in 1957, that was a lot, but it was effective. After hearing them, promoter Sid Prohan signed them. Paul turned into Jerry Landis. Art changed his name to Tom Graff. On the Billboard charts, the single peaked at number 49. More than 100,000 copies were sold. They were featured on American Bandstand as well. They were famous at the age of 15. However, danger was already simmering beneath the surface. Paul was doing more than just singing even back then. When he was only 12 or 13, he wrote their debut song, The Girl for Me. The words and chords were even written by his father, whose paper is now at the Library of Congress. Art's voice was superior. Paul had the drive and the pen. The unbalanced performance of Paul's art was present from the beginning and would only worsen. Paul led a covert musical life from 1957 to 1964. He also recorded more than 30 tracks under false aliases while still working with Art, True Taylor, Paul Kane, and Jerry Landis. He collaborated with Amy, Big Hunt, King, Tribute, Madison, and several other labels. This was more than a pastime. Behind Art's back, Paul was quietly establishing a separate career. He was doing more than just recording his own music. He was producing and writing for other people. By 1962, he was producing songs for Richie Cordell, The Vevels, and Doy Daniels while working for Amy Records. In 1958, he released his first single as True Taylor. That indicates that only a few months after Hey School's triumph, he was already preparing for his own career. When Sid Prohan went straight to Paul and offered him solo deals without telling Art, that's when the real damage happened. Paul didn't bring it up. When Art later learned, it devastated him. Later, he claimed that their friendship was destroyed by the betrayal. Never did he forgive it. Paul was planning his escape while Art continued to trust in their partnership. Given that Tom and Jerry were having trouble reproducing their first hit, that was really painful. Paul didn't hold off. He went on. It wasn't until it was too late that Art realized what was happening. Even worse was Paul's triumph without Art. Paul achieved a little hit with Motorcycle in 1962 while performing with a new group called Tico and the Triumphs. At number 99 on the Billboard charts it was released. He also published The Lone Teen Ranger, directed by Jerry Landis at the same time. At number 97 on the ranking, these were minor victories, but they demonstrated that Paul could achieve without Art. Even though Marty Cooper, another singer, was the face of the Tico and the Triumphs project, it exposed Paul's cunning side. The song that charted included Paul as the lead vocalist. Behind the scenes he was pulling strings while maintaining his own persona. This supported Paul's pre-existing beliefs. He could do it by himself. His previous betrayal seems much more calculated in light of that. He wasn't only taking a chance. Without telling Art, he was taking Art's place. They broke up in 1958. At the time it wasn't dramatic. The damage was extensive, yet they only drifted. It took them 5 whole years, until 1963, to get back in touch. Paul released almost 30 tracks under several identities during that period. Art also attempted to create music, but he didn't get too far without Paul's ambition and network. Because they missed one another, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel did not get back together in 1963. They were in a grave situation. Paul was barely surviving by 1963. He pitched songs to labels by cold contacting them while working for a music publisher. Producer Tom Wilson of Columbia Records was drawn to one of his tracks, He Was My Brother. Wilson, however, did not desire Paul. He wanted a British group to sing the tune. Paul then took a risk. He persuaded Wilson to let him and Art to try out in a studio. The Sound of Silence was the song they sung. Wilson, who had collaborated with jazz greats such as Miles Davis, was taken aback. He admired Art's distinct voice and Paul's lyrics. They earned a solid deal after that one tryout. They went by their true names for the first time. However, their problems were only getting started. Wednesday morning 3 a.m. their debut album was a complete bust. In barely 8 months after its October 1964 release, only 1,000 copies were sold. Suddenly the folk sound they relied on was no longer relevant. Everything had altered because of the Beatles. At the worst possible moment, Columbia attempted to promote them as a part of the traditional tradition. They received poor reviews. Sales were terrible. The two parted ways once more. Paul fled to England. He performed at little clubs. There he even recorded the Paul Simon Songbook, a solo album. Art meanwhile remained in New York and returned to Columbia University. Unbeknownst to them, Paul's songs from this solitary exile would eventually appear on their hits. Then a bizarre incident occurred. Producer Tom Wilson secretly added drums and electric guitars to The Sound of Silence in 1965. He completed it immediately following Bob Dylan's sessions with the Rolling Stones. He made no request for authorization. He kept it from them. It worked when he simply let it go. Radios in Florida and Boston began airing the remixed version. When Simon was performing in Denmark, he discovered the most bizarre way to read Billboard magazine. On January 1, 1966, the song peaked at number 1. Paul was taken aback. Paul was taken aback by the remix, but Art called to rejoice. He detested the shifts in rhythm. It was still a success. To ride the wave, they quickly got back together to make a new album. However, something had changed. Paul desired complete control by 1966. He took over everything as he recorded Time, Rosemary, Sage and Parsley. He was in charge of the instruments. He managed the sound. He was in the studio for months. His experience in England was the inspiration for several of his songs. The main reason Garfunkel was there was to sing. That was it. The album was an enormous hit. It sold millions of copies and peaked at number 4 on the Billboard list. Paul, however, began to believe that he was the mastermind behind it all. Art only provided the voice. That disparity would only worsen. The Graduate followed. Their song was utilized in the 1967 movie by director Mike Nichols. They became well known as a result. Mrs. The movie was a huge hit despite though Robinson wasn't done when it was released. The soundtrack achieved the top spot. They spent 16 weeks at the top of the charts with Bookends, their subsequent album. At the Grammys they took home the Record of the Year award. However, success also brought fractures. Paul thought Art was getting too much credit. Fans thought the tracks were composed by Art. It was Art who received the praise, while Paul was the author. It was best expressed by their manager. Both of them felt jealous of the other. Paul was insecure, which made everything worse. Paul never forgot Art's quip that "I'll always be taller than you." It hurt for decades. Art was taller and more photogenic. Then the last blow was delivered. They were requested to perform in Catch-22 by Mike Nichols. Paul's role was cut, but both were cast. The film was reduced to Art. Paul felt ashamed. To film the film, Art traveled to Mexico. Paul did not leave New York. Everything was shattered by that split. Paul had anticipated that they would continue to compose music. Rather, Art was absent for several months.
A year passed when it should have only been 6 weeks. 2 lengthy sessions were required to record their album, Bridge Over Troubled Water, first in November 1968, then a year later. Paul stewed and waited in between. Woodstock arrived and left. They were unable to perform. Art continued to shoot. Paul made an effort to continue working, but things were never the same. Real-time feedback had always been the foundation of their creative process. In the same room, 2 voices. Art now requested that Paul send cassettes to Mexico. Art would return with modifications. He'd reply, "No, that part's no good." Paul felt like a lower-level worker. It was humiliating. This was never intended to be the case. Art then made a statement that put an end to it all. Paul gave a succinct response when he said, "Here's how it'll be. I'll make movies for 6 months, then come back and you'll have written the songs and we'll do the album." No, that won't take place. He wasn't simply turning down a plan. He was dismissing the entire notion of being a songwriter for someone else. Paul had consistently composed the songs, directed the sessions, and created the tone. Fans, however, applauded for Art. When Art performed Bridge Over Troubled Water live, the audience erupted. The last sessions for Bridge Over Troubled Water were lonesome, with Paul standing in the background thinking, "That's my song, man." Paul was by himself with the producer and the band. Mexico was where Art was. To facilitate Art's travels, even the instruments for the title tune were recorded in California. However, Art performed it alone and received standing ovations when it was time to sing it. Their greatest and final hit would be that album. Most people assumed Paul Simon would recover quickly after his separation from Garfunkel in 1970. After all, Bridge Over Troubled Water had just topped the charts for 6 weeks in a row and became a worldwide success. Paul, however, was secretly afraid. He took chances because of that anxiety. Paul Simon, his debut solo album, was released in January 1972. A dinner item featuring chicken and eggs served as the inspiration for one of the songs, Mother and Child Reunion. The music, however, was the true twist. Paul had accompanied Jimmy Cliff's band to Kingston, Jamaica, where they recorded reggae music. It was successful. In both the US and the UK, the song made it to the top 5. Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, another song that peaked at number 22, demonstrated that Paul was still capable of crafting narrative songs. The album peaked at number 4 on the US charts and even reached the top of the UK and Japanese charts. Paul released There Goes Rhymin' Simon in 1973. His self-assurance was rapidly increasing. He experimented with new instruments and techniques. Using photography as a clever means of discussing memory, the single Kodak Chrome peaked at number 2. Next on the Cashbox charts was Loves Me Like a Rock. For backing vocals, he enlisted the gospel ensemble Dixie Hummingbirds, something he had never done before. Despite not being a huge chart smash, the song American Tune struck a chord. In just a few lyrics, it encapsulated the nation's post-Vietnam melancholy and lifted a melody from Bach. On Cashbox, that album peaked at number 1. After all these years, Paul finally released Still Crazy in 1975, 2 years later. His darkest piece to date was this one. Despite being filled with grief and uncertainty, the songs were a smash, and he had recently divorced Peggy Harper. Paul won the Grammy for Best Male Pop Voice. The album peaked at number 1 on Billboard, and it was named Album of the Year. 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover is the most popular song. In early 1976, it topped the charts for 3 weeks. My Little Town, an unexpected reunion with Art Garfunkel, also peaked at number 9 on that same album. Paul's personal life, meanwhile, was everything from steady. He married Princess Leia, whose real name is Carrie Fisher, in 1983. They had a fast-paced relationship. They fell in love right away after meeting during the Star Wars frenzy. But getting married while on his reunion tour with Garfunkel turned out to be a disastrous decision. Paul reflected in a 2024 documentary, describing the marriage as draining. Carrie was constantly in the news. She knew what fame was. Paul didn't. Paul simply wasn't suited for the media, and she treated it like a game. Despite only lasting 11 months, their marriage had a lasting impact. Both were at the pinnacle of their careers. Paul had returned to the limelight. Hollywood was still centered on Carrie. The marriage felt like a hurricane, according to Paul's best man Lorne Michaels. They were surrounded by fame all the time. Later, Paul acknowledged that he was exhausted by Car's universe. Her addictions, her mood swings, and her passion for the spotlight. Everything was too much. "I feel like life has become a media circus," he remarked. Paul's music was infused with the emotional turmoil. Despite being praised by critics, his 1983 album Hearts and Bones was a commercial failure. Even if the songs were honest, intimate, and profound, fans didn't relate, at least not at the time. In retrospect, he was obviously unraveling on the inside. Meanwhile, new issues were brought on by the fame and fortune. Their marriage endured numerous camera flashes, 5-star hotels, and private planes. According to Lorne Michaels, It was like being stuck in a dream. Paul, however, thought it was more like a nightmare. Carrie flourished there. Paul didn't. He had the impression that he was acting in order to survive. Paul altered after they parted ways. In 1992, he wed Eddie Bickle, and the two of them created a much more tranquil existence with 3 children. After that, he avoided the tabloids. Paul, however, was not without controversy. He visited South Africa during the apartheid era in 1985. Any cultural exchange with the government was strictly prohibited by the UN. Nevertheless, Paul went. He recorded in Soweto for 9 days with local musicians. They operated in dread, with police threats and curfews. Paul paid them $200 per hour, which was more than 3 times what they were paid in New York. Locals only earned $15 per day. Activists were still incensed. Paul consented to apartheid simply by being there, according to Ghana's UN envoy. The backlash was swift. He was followed by protests in Birmingham and London. He was denounced by musicians. Additionally, picket lines trailed Paul everywhere he went while on tour with Graceland. Then another scandal arose. This one is about stealing. Paul was accused by Los Lobos' Steve Berlin of stealing their music. Berlin claimed that Paul requested them to jam during the Graceland sessions, despite having absolutely nothing. They did. Paul utilized that tune on the album later without mentioning them. Berlin claimed that when they objected, Paul just said, "Sue me. See what happens." Paul refuted this. Los Lobos, however, said they received nothing. No acknowledgement. Just silence. No compensation. Credit disputes increased, particularly among African musicians. While some felt taken advantage of, others supported Paul. The hard reality was expressed by South African jazz icon Jonas Gwangwa, who quipped, "So it takes another white man to discover my people." Although Simon pledged royalties and paid above market rates, many felt he still had too much power. Paul refused to give up. According to him, the protest was the music itself. He felt the message was in the teamwork, thus he didn't write political songs. To make matters worse, he also claimed, "I didn't ask permission from the ANC." He was blacklisted by the UN and the ANC. He was accused of violating international law and expelled from South Africa. His name was taken down by the UN in 1987, but the harm had already been done. When Paul returned to London decades later, artists like Jerry Dammers and Billy Bragg continued to protest. A chance meeting in 1975 was the beginning of it all. Art Garfunkel and Paul Simon had not communicated much since their acrimonious breakup in 1970. However, they found themselves in the same room once more while recording with John Lennon and Harry Nilsson in a Los Angeles studio. Something made sense. The tension appeared to dissipate, and it seemed like the old days for a while. They made the decision to try again as a duet. That year they were in the studio for months. They seemed to be pursuing the past in an attempt to resurrect the enchantment that brought them fame. However, it was unsuccessful. They only sang one song, My Little Town, after all that work. Ironically, rather than being on a collaborative album, the song was included on each of their solo albums. They seemed to want to get back together, but they couldn't even agree on how to share their one song. It served as a forewarning of all that lay ahead. Then there was a peak. They stood together in Central Park on September 19, 1981. More than 500,000 individuals attended. The huge grass was crowded in every direction. People sat on rooftops, scaled trees, and did anything else to get a look. The concert was historic in addition to being large. HBO spent over $1 million to broadcast it. The live recording achieved double platinum status. To assist in repairing the dilapidated park, they raised $51,000. Old albums made a comeback to the charts. The world seemed to want them back. However, things were already beginning to fall apart behind the scenes. A 1982 world tour resulted from the success. That ought to have been their major resurgence. Instead, it demonstrated how severely they disagreed. They fell silent. Complete silence, not merely disagreements. They would sing flawless harmonies every night before leaving the stage to go their separate ways. They weren't even acting friendly. The songs had a united sound. It was a chilly reality. Prior to the tour, they attempted to rectify it. Promises, hopes, and sincere conversations. However, the fissures grew worse as they struck the road. Even sitting in the same car was out of the question. The show was viewed by fans, but it was a slow-motion collapse behind the curtain. Things became much more repulsive in 1983. They were recording their first album since Bridge Over Troubled Water, titled Think Too Much. Garfunkel recorded a number of songs vocals. They intended for it to be a whole Simon and Garfunkel record, but Paul had other ideas. Without telling Garfunkel, he concluded that the songs were too intimate, particularly the one concerning his connection with Carrie Fisher. He re-recorded everything, removed Art's vocals, and renamed the band Hearts and Bones, before releasing the solo. Garfunkel was smashed.